Hi, we're back again with Brian Thomas, a former AP newsman, most recently of the AP Bureau in Washington, D.C., a long career in radio news. And Bryant, what I want to talk to you about tonight is it's something we've discussed before, but now there are like new developments in mainstream media. Now, for over a year and a half, the media and all the so-called experts and the talking heads that we see constantly on the networks were all poo-pooing even the possibility, even the remote possibility of the Wuhan lab possibly being the origin of COVID-19. Now, all of a sudden, that's turned around that well, maybe it was started there. Maybe there was a possibility, contrary to their hard and fast dismissals up until now. So what do you make of that? What I make of it is it's another example of the increasing bias in the media where instead of objective reporters and investigators, they become cheerleaders and propagandists for their favorite candidates and causes. What do you make of it?
Well, I had always thought that the lab in that Chinese lab had been the source of the virus. I had never thought anything else, even when all of the experts were saying that this was not likely. So this doesn't really surprise me. What did surprise me is that, as you point out, the mainstream media were so eager to accept it, and I think perhaps we've learned a good lesson here, and that is only believe half of what you see and none of what you hear.
Yeah, now Brian, we've been in the news for decades, most of our adult lives. Now, when we started out, sure there was bias, there was slant, but not to the extent it is today. And the straight news stories, by and large, were fairly straight, where both sides were presented, and then the reader or the listener would have to decide. Now it's one side is presented. There's all kinds of pejorative adjectives used, all kinds of unsubstantiated conclusions. I mean, clearly, this is a whole different realm now of media coverage. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and it all depends on which side you're talking to about whether the other side is full of what you know what. This is going on and on and on, and the net result is more polarization among the American electorate. The other morning, someone said something very interesting. Donnie Deutsch, one of the branding experts that's on MSNBC, was asked about whether he thought anything could come along that would suddenly turn around some of the diehard supporters of Trump and change their minds about his behavior and his attitude and his speeches and his goals. And he said, I don't know. I don't know that there is anything out there anymore. I think those people are hopelessly in bed with Trump. And I think that's a real shocking admission from someone on the other side of the fence.
I don't understand the point that you're making in terms of slanted news. I mean, what's there, for all the 4 years of his presidency, even before he took office, it was one thing after another that he was being criticized for. When he woke up in the morning, if he didn't put his shoes on right, and a lot of this was largely discredited. Like that whole thing about Russian collusion. Uh, it was finally, it would show that there was nothing to it. Now they were on him from day one. I am not exonerating Trump for whatever sins he might have committed, but I'm saying they clearly were on his case. They clearly had an agenda. And I'm not saying the other side isn't guilty of it either. Fox News has its own slant, but it's polar opposite of the slants on MSNBC, CNN, et cetera, et cetera. But none of them are playing it straight. And this is the death of legitimate journalism, and eventually the death of the republic. Our democracy depends on people being accurately informed, and this is heading in a very bad direction.
I agree. I mean, but I don't know that there's any quick solution to this. I think one of the problems is that everybody's ratcheted up to the point of euphoria on making a case for their particular point of view, that it doesn't matter what the other side says, it's going to be wrong out of the gate.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. And I don't know if there's any immediate solution to that. I don't see it.
My question would be, how did it get to this point? What drove this? Was it just journalists who were maybe half-baked, the new generation, where they grew up with an attitude of social justice rather than objectivity, or was it when the news became increasingly a profit center rather than a public service, they had to start catering to specific demographics? And as we've discussed before, Fox is the one that led the way, but by having a niche audience where they didn't have to get everybody on board of all political persuasion, but if they had just the conservative audience, that was enough to give them blockbuster ratings. Then the other cable stations follow the same formula, but for the liberal side. So they were both competing for specific audiences to keep the ratings up, and objectivity went down the drain.
Well, I think to some degree that's correct. I would go back even further than Fox News, and I would say that the beginning of the end for objective journalism started with the passage of the Telecommunications Act of 1996.
Good point.
When radio stations were absolved from having news departments.
Right.
And you saw so many local news departments, which are indeed the cornerstone of good information at the local level, filtered through people who view things at that local level, and sensitive to what's going on to their listeners at the local level. That's gone. And when it went, it allowed for the homogenization of product at the Rush Limbaugh level, at the Liddy level. All of those people had a foothold in mainstream media that they never had before, and indeed had it from coast to coast, because it was easier to put stuff on the air off the bird than it was to do your own stuff.
And also recall for the audience what that act did in terms of narrowing the competition and having very few huge corporations controlling most of the news. Review that for us.
Well, I think that's, there's 6 or 7 major corporations that do control the news in this country, or at least have the parent organization cooperation involved in it. And I think that that's an issue that the American public is going to be very, very slow to grasp, because it's kind of filtered and it's kind of remote. And no matter how much harping we do on it, it's going to be an issue because it doesn't excite people. They don't understand that there's a direct connection between that and what people do and think. Years ago, I was told by a master sergeant when I was in the Air Force, don't ever forget one thing: as a news person on the radio, you have the ability to change men's minds. And that's a solemn and sacred trust. And a lot of us have seen that just wither away. It's gone.
More specifically, though, the consolidation of news outlets. There are far fewer now. There used to be a rule that broadcast stations were limited to so many per market. Go through that for us.
Well, originally the FCC had set a goal of 7 AMs, 7 FMs, and 7 TVs under one blanket ownership. So if CBS owned a station in New York and a station in Boston, a station in Washington, and a station in Chicago, and San Francisco and Los Angeles, and maybe Dallas, that was it. They could own no more. The Telecommunications Act of 96 got rid of all of that. I was at a station that was bought, and when American Radio was dissolved, when it was sold to CBS, they were up to over 200 stations. And if you don't call that mind-boggling and mind-controlling, I don't know what you do.
Yeah, and that was pushed through by the Clinton administration, was it not?
Well, it didn't. It started in that area, in that era rather, there were four parts to the Telecommunications Act, and the part that excited Clinton and Gore the most was the quick development of the internet.
Mhm.
And what they did not see was the rest of the bill coming back to bite them in the rear end. And the biggest thing was, of course, this homogenization of ownership. And I had lobbied very unsuccessfully to the state chairman of our Democratic Party, where I was working at the time, to set him straight on this. This is going to be curtains for the Democratic Party if you let this go through, because everybody who has an outlet for the Democratic Party at the local level is going to have it removed because news departments are going to go away. And right over the head. No clue what I was talking about.
Also, the fairness doctrine was tossed aside. And what were the consequences of that? And how did it work before?
Well, you said fairness doctrine?
Yeah.
Well, the fairness doctrine was being whittled away long before the Telecommunications Act of 96 was passed. And I think if you go back and look at what happened with the fairness doctrine, it was the people like Patrick Buchanan, who was the White House telecommunications director under Richard Nixon, if you remember, had always taken a dim view of it because it allowed Democrats to get equal time for the presidential response after an address. And then it was extended to include regular newscasts. And that was the big rub right there, is that one party did not want the other to have an equal shot at the airwaves, whether it was the Republicans in charge or the Democrats in charge. It didn't matter. Each, when out of office, viewed it as an anathema. And when they got back in office, then it was the best thing since sliced bread. So it all depends on who was running the show.
Yeah. Now, what do you think now? Also, the influence of the internet, where it's really the death of newspapers. People are reading much less. It's all broadcast. It's all pictures. It's all sound. It's all jazzed up for infotainment increasingly. So, what's the effect of fewer newspapers?
Well, I think if you think back, I'll tell you a story about my daughter. Now, here's a woman who was put through college by AM radio, my paycheck. She bought a new car in the early 80s, maybe mid 80s. And 2 weeks after she bought it, I got into it for the first time. And we lived kind of high up on a hill in Connecticut. And I reached down to play with the radio to see the sensitivity of the FM dial. And we were pulling in stations from Worcester, Massachusetts, and Peekskill, New York, far away stations, indicating that the sensitivity of that factory radio in that car of hers was pretty good. So then I flipped the band to AM. It was dead. No sound, no crackling, no stations, no nothing.
Yeah.
She didn't know it. Why? Because she never turned it on AM.
They only listen to FM. They grew up.
So there it is right there. So amplify that 10 times over with the internet, and you've really got a problem with people not understanding where true objective journalism comes from. And the problem is that anybody who puts up a website is free to say anything they want. And there's no, check and balance. It's just all this junk on there that people are exposed to day in and day out, and they don't get a chance to hear the true stories behind all of the allegations.
Well, I agree fairly much with what you just said. However, the internet is still one of the last places to turn to if you use it intelligently, with discretion, and know which websites to go to, who's credible on there. Is it some whack job in his basement, or is it some guy who's been a reporter all his life and may have
But you know what? The average Joe is not going to go through all those hoops,
It's
and
not
you
gonna,
know that as well as I do.
yeah. Well, I know, for instance, in my case, a lot of my research comes from the internet, but from sites that I trust, and I know the people behind them, and I know their backgrounds in journalism, and I know the stories behind them. And you need that now as a balance. If you could use it that way, you need that as a balance to the largely propaganda barrage that's on TV on all the networks now, and nobody's playing it straight anymore. One of the good things about Fox News, I already said, it does have its agenda, its bias, its slant. However, what they are doing for their own political purposes is airing stories that you won't see on the other networks. And with Fox being Republican oriented, they go after Democrats. But whether or not it's for the ulterior motives, politically, and not altruistic, still they're getting stories out that you're not seeing on these other stations. So in that way, it's kind of a balance. In case in point that I mentioned before, the Hunter Biden laptop story with very damaging materials on Hunter and his work with his father, who was a sitting vice president, with foreign nationals who were involved in business dealers with Hunter Biden while his old man was vice president. And the other stations did not carry it before the election because they knew that would have damaged Biden. So there's an example that, even a station like Fox with its own bias serves a purpose because at least they're getting stories out with their slant, but basic information that you're not getting anywhere else on Hunter Biden and other stories. But again, getting back to newspapers, there used to be a lot of them, several in each town. Even where we grew up in Waterbury, there were 2 or 3 newspapers, Waterbury, Connecticut, 2 or 3 newspapers at one time. Then it went down to 2. Now there's only 1. And that's largely the pattern in other cities of that size and all over the country, as a matter of fact. So, there's less variety there. And also, I think people who read print absorb more. You go back over, the paragraph, what does this mean, this and that. Whereas on the electronic media, it flashes by, and there's less room for reflection. So that again is a destructive influence on people getting the information they need to make wise judgments.
Well, I think the issue of the dumbing down of America started a long time ago.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it started in schools when civics stopped being taught, and geography and all the other things that you need to function. And the dumbing down of America started when people were not taught things in school, civics and geography,
right,
and all of the things that you and I were taught way back in the Stone Ages when we went to grammar school and high school. And the things that I found most shocking was that many of the kids that I taught at the University of Connecticut were not even up to the 10th grade level in terms of civics understanding that I was at when I was in 10th grade.
yeah,
And here they are as juniors and seniors getting close to graduating college.
right.
And somewhere along the way, we lost that. And by the time a kid gets into college, it's assumed that he knows all of that or she knows all of that. And I'm sorry, they don't know that much. They don't know how it functions, how government works, how they have to take a role in it. And that's just tragic to be that ignorant.
Yeah. I mean, the First Amendment was set up to keep the public informed, a check and balance on government. And, Thomas Jefferson, I've used this example before, who among those pushing for the First Amendment.
Mhm.
He hated the newspapers of his day because they're after him unfairly. He said that they're full of lies, the newspapers of his day, full of misinformation. However, he said, you keep it wide open, the marketplace of ideas, so anybody can publish what they want. And in the balance, the electorate will get some kind of a picture of what's going on. So, again, now there are people that are saying the First Amendment is outmoded. There are journalism professors now teaching the importance, the primacy of social justice rather than objectivity in journalism. So where are we going with that? We're already halfway to George Orwell's state news, where it's all controlled by the government. It's a narrative that the government or other forces want you to know and what you're not supposed to know. More and more we see that. And, people say the boiling frog analogy, little by little raise the temperature, you don't notice anymore until you wake up and, any kind of news that's not approved is unavailable.
Well, that's true. Let me tell you a story about Ned Cole. Ned Cole was the Revitalization Corps director in Hartford. It was an anti-poverty group. Ned Cole was a spitting image of John F. Kennedy.
This is Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford, Connecticut.
Right. And Ned Cole decided to run for president. He was barely 35 years old, maybe 36 or 37. But he thought he could dazzle everybody the way Kennedy did with his progressive platform. And he went up to New Hampshire, and the Union leader cut him to shreds.
The newspaper in New Hampshire, very conservative, controlled by William Loeb. Okay.
Correct. And I'm getting to that. Anyway, they cut him to shreds. And not only in the reporting columns, but in the editorial pages, which were directly controlled by William Loeb. So after the primary was over, Ned Cole came back to Hartford, and I had him on my talk show at the radio station in Hartford where I was working. And one of the quotes that he said was, "The Union Leader newspaper perpetuates negativism. Everything it does is negative. I wouldn't be surprised if in the weather column, they would never say that it was going to be a sunny day." Well, yours truly fed all of those cuts to 2 stations in Manchester, New Hampshire. And on a Monday morning, they played all those cuts on those 2 radio stations. Loeb went into orbit. And at 10 minutes after 9, Loeb's attorney from Boston called the news director of the radio station that I worked at in Hartford, because they tracked it down that quickly, and started in with the threats. Well, the news director at the time was a fellow by the name of Joe Barbarette, who had just completed a stint as Senator Tom Dodd's press aide. So Joe was not easily stampeded into being threatened. And the conversation went back and forth, and the lawyer said, "We could sue you for this." And Joe Barbarette said, "Sue us for what?" And he said, "For putting this nut on the air. This nut," Joe Barbarette said, "is running for president of the United States, and he can say any damn thing he wants to." And he hung up the phone. That was the end of Loeb's lawyers. They never made another peep about that. But it's still the intimidation factor. That's what I'm saying here. That's what's going on now.
Oh, yeah.
And there's no question that it started years and years ago. And for most people, a good, woodshed bashing like that works. There's no question about it.
People are afraid to speak out now because their jobs are in jeopardy. They may have a mob around their house.
Exactly.
That intimidation works more and more.
It works. There's no question about it.
Social media, look at how that's controlled now. And more is coming out about the collusion with Zuckerberg and the others with the Democrats about the COVID crisis, which was an effort to get Trump out. And that worked too. And speaking about suppressing the guy who ran for president way back then, well, Trump now is not carried by social media. Even while he was president, they were cutting him out. So, no matter what you think of Trump, that's a very dangerous precedent.
It is. I agree. And, I think that we are yet to see the depths of this, in whether it was just a putrid dislike for Trump or whether it was part of a bigger scheme. I don't know yet. I don't think anybody knows yet.
I think, whether it was a larger scheme, what I think is now that pattern is set and being accepted by the public, or, those who don't accept it can't do anything about it, they're going to continue to do it. I mean, look at even the anchors on TV. Uh, Stephanopoulos, he's a former Clinton operative, and then suddenly he's an objective newsman, and that's repeated on both sides. Uh, they have hire consultants who are former political figures, administration officials, rather than an outside analyst. So naturally they're going to have the slant of the political party to which they're attached.
Look, don't forget one thing. Youth consultant is a euphemism for unemployed.
Yeah.
Just never forget that. Never forget that.
Well, that goes to the revolving door, and what goes on with all these regulatory agencies. They regulate favorably for the companies that they later work for, are hired by. So it's it's a revolving door. I mean, it's so fixed on every level now, so controlled. We both know, even in our day when we were starting off, there was that afoot. And you always have it in politics, some corruption, but it's reached such a stage now that it's merging all together. And it really is, in my opinion, fascism, which is by definition the merger of corporate and state interests. And that is exactly what is going on. And I don't see any way they're going to diminish this unless there's some move made to use existing antitrust laws to break up the social media monopolies.
And there's a move afoot to do that.
Whether that succeeds, I don't know, because there's so many financial interests, even among our senators and Congress people and other leaders. They have their own ties financially, so they're all benefiting from that collusion. They're certainly benefiting from their deals with China. So that's another thing. In my opinion, Biden is just giving lip service to corralling China, because don't forget, he led the way to admit China into the World Trade Organization and give them most favourable nation status. And he's been saying all along that they're not going to eat our lunch. They're great people. We'll both prosper. Now he's giving lip service that we got to do something about it. But I don't see much of a chance of him actually doing something to rein in China, because there are too many connections now with him, his son, and all the other politicians and corporate leaders who are all entangled and feeding off of China.
In both parties.
Both parties.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
If you admit enough people to the party, then it's not a party anymore. It's an orgy.
Yeah. I mean, and again, the newer generation is getting so used to this being the norm that are they really going to know that they're being misinformed, that they're being manipulated? I think maybe less and less. And will they even care? Since more and more it's infotainment, there's so many outlets now to be entertained passively that how many people are really going to analyze things anymore or care about it?
Well, and I look at my grandchildren who have never picked up a newspaper, and even though there's one delivered to the house, I've never seen them pick it up unless they're in it.
Yeah.
For something they did at school or something at the firehouse or something where they're involved. But to pick it up and read news stories, I don't see that at all.
See, another bad element there is that with people, far fewer people now reading newspapers, there's less attention paid to the local government. At least a local newspaper, whether it was slanted or not, especially when you had several in town, one might be Republican and one might be Democrat, but at least it would be reporting local news, local government, what your city council did, what the school board is doing. Now, because of the electronic media, all the attention is in national news, national figures, and the big pictures, big elements in the news.
And that sets the stage for more corruption locally.
Yeah, because locally nobody's watching.
Nobody's watching. That's right. That's right.
So, another thing before we wrap it up for this session, another example of the reluctance reversal, if you want to call that, of a story that they poo-pooed, hydroxychloroquine. Now, as you know, my wife is a pharmacist. A year and a half ago, she was saying publicly that when applied in the right dosage and early, it is effective, there's no consequences. Now they're finally at least giving some airtime to doctors and experts, not crackpots, who are saying, yeah, it could have been effective and it could have saved lives, but that was shut down too. No, you couldn't even talk about it. So again, the way the news now is being orchestrated, is a grave disservice to the public and a grave danger to our republic.
Well, I think if you think back of the hydroxychloroquine comments that were made during the White House briefings on that, you got such a rousing endorsement of it from Trump, based on a couple of things that were whispered into his ear, rather than having read extensively about it, which was what most presidents would do. And that was part of the wrinkle right there, is that if Trump had not been trumpeting all of this stuff, it might have gotten better traction.
No.
And I think that, the minute Trump embraced anything regarding this this outbreak, it became poisoned, and that was an example of that. Whether it was true or not, the minute he touched it, it turned to poison.
But I think, part of the larger picture might have been, I'm not saying this is so, but might have been the goal of suppressing any other effective cheap treatments and waiting for the big pharma to come in with their vaccines that were making a heck of a lot of money on it.
Oh, sure.
And much more expensive.
Of course.
And more and more is coming out now from doctors and others who say that this was hyped up. I mean, the danger was real. The COVID-19 could have been deadly, but they were pumping up the numbers because they wanted to keep the public alarmed.
And they were. The public was alarmed.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that there probably could have been other things done during the process, but so many people were dying so quickly, that you had the stampede of horror going on, and that's what allowed all the big pharma players to say, look, we're going to find a vaccine for this, we're going to fix it, but give us a little time. Could the hydroxychloroquine been a mitigator? Maybe.
Yes.
To what degree? Who knows? No one knows.
I think to a large degree. And now, if you do the research, there had already been studies on that about how effective it was, and they just squelched it. I mean, one thing after another. China was suppressing all the information about the possible origin in the Wuhan lab, and we just accepted that. I mean, they were allowing no possibility. Fauci, what was almost entirely excluding any possibility that it could have come from the lab. Now he's backing off on that because this information is coming out. This whole thing was largely orchestrated. And this is, again, emblematic now of what's going on with the control of information. It is becoming controlled by the government and special interests. We're halfway to 1984. And I don't think it's going to get any better anytime soon.
We may be closer than that. We may be closer than that.
No.
I think that the republic is teetering, and a lot of people don't realize how close we are.
Yeah, and even me raising these questions, there's a possibility they won't even allow this on. Now they're easing up on it because they're kind of being forced to. Mm-hmm. But if I was talking this way a year and a half ago about this, that might have been suppressed, taken down. And again, this is forcing journalists to self-censor. Even those that are sincere and want to get at the truth, they're self-censoring because they don't want to be shut down. So, the grip,
or fired.
The grip is tightening.
Yeah, it is. I agree. And what the short-term and long-term solutions are and situations are, I don't think we know yet. It's not a good sign, but I don't think we know yet.
Well, stay tuned. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of other media topics that we'll be discussing in the weeks ahead. Bryant Thomas, formerly of AP News Bureau in Washington, D.C., a long career in news. Brian Thomas, thanks once again for joining us.
You bet.